This video is sponsored by Bambu Lab. Everybody dreams of flying, but in the grim darkness of the far future, that dream turns into a nightmare when it's not you that's flying, but the Genestealer corrupted Space Marines that grew these very terrifying Tyranid-looking wings. Now comes the interesting journey of trying to attach them to the Space Marines and make them look pretty cool. And of course, I first needed some Space Marines, and while I was assembling them, I thought it'd be a pretty good idea to attach a Tyranid leg to one of them. But as with any experimentation, sometimes things just don't go your way. But I'm quite glad that I still gave it an attempt, and in the future, I'd like to make it work. However, with one leg down, this did mean that I had to find an extra Space Marine and scrub him off some paint. While I do want most of them to have a power pack, the idea of the Primus of the group having a lot more carapace and alien mutations did intrigue me. My Genestealers view their mutations as the blessings from the four-armed Emperor. As a result, the more mutations and just weird variations they have, the closer they are to the perceived perfection of the Emperor. With such a massive amount of carapace, I did shave the back of the Space Marine just a little bit. I had to avoid cutting into the carapace just to make sure that the wings do not get in the way of the actual armor. The two parts were looking pretty good, but I was gonna need some green stuff to make most of this project happen. More than just connecting all of the parts together, I thought using green stuff could create a much more interesting story. That unlike regular Space Marines, these Genestealers are entombed in their armor, permanently. When some of their mutations start growing, it dissolves the ceramite, absorbing it and creating much more powerful pieces of carapace. One of Primus's mutation not only did that, but it also absorbed the reactor and combined with it, creating a powerful biological reactor that is hidden underneath all of that carapace. And while that makes it stronger, the toxic byproduct of the reactor is slowly poisoning him. With the first member finished, I had to figure out how I was going to make the rest of them work. I had a drastic jump in difficulty trying to work on the rest of these miniatures as I no longer had a singular piece with a carapace connecting to the wings. I had to find a way to not only attach the wings, but then find a good way to make sure that the power pack isn't directly interfering with them. The buffer created from the green stuff did a really good job at separating the parts. However, this did introduce a new challenge. Since quite obviously these parts were not meant to be on a Space Marine, I had to find different ways to angle them to make sure that they matched the pose I was trying to create. With all the parts clustered together, it was a particularly interesting challenge trying to sculpt underneath several of the parts. If you've ever painted a model and you were in the situation where the brush would clearly be grabbing other parts and interfering with them, this was quite similar. I was quite worried that by trying to sculpt the green stuff and remove some of the excessive amount, I'd be moving the parts around. This meant working quite slowly in the green stuff and trying to create a compromise between something that looks decent and something that creates a decent enough function. After struggling quite a bit with the first Space Marine, I decided to adjust my strategy in how I was going to attach the wings. Since working the Primus was a particularly easy task since all I had to do was attach the two pieces together, I tried to recreate the exact same idea. I created a separate piece of the power pack connected to the wings, and attached it to the pre-sculpted green stuff on the body. Now instead of having to worry about removing all of the excessive green stuff and not compromising the integrity, all I had to do was just focus on sculpting some pretty okay looking details. And to remove some of the sharpness created by my toothpick, I then used a little bit of the silicone tip to smooth out those details. Then repeated the process for the rest of them, and each time I worked on a different Space Marine, the process got easier and easier. Now comes the fun part of trying to attach all the different pieces and mix and match the combination of Space Marine and Genestealer. I pre-selected several heads that I knew would be absolutely perfect for this project. 3 of the heads came from the Aberrant Zed as they were quite monstrous and had very gruesome mutations. The 4th head came from the Neophyte hybrids as I wanted to showcase the difference in some of the mutations. And the last one has a Space Marine helmet. So allow your imagination to run wild and imagine what sort of monstrosity could possibly be underneath there. I wanted to give some time for my green stuff to dry so I don't accidentally move it, so I opened up the Bambu Lab Handy app from the sponsors of today's video. Found myself a pretty cool container to hold all of my different bits and started printing that. It's honestly quite impressive how they managed to make the process so simple. I didn't have to do any of the complicated stuff, I just had to find the file I thought would look cool, select the filament I want to use, and click print. 2.5 hours later, I had this really awesome storage container for all of my bits. Now, instead of this very tiny weird container, I have this really beautifully stacked, interesting container full of the bits, and surprisingly easy to access any level and have all of the bits. It also looks really good and the quality is fantastic. Don't miss out on Bambulab's exciting deals of the year. From December 3rd to January 3rd, explore the amazing offers on their Xmas page and grab the best deals of the season. So I took the layer holding the Space Marine bits and I started going through it and try to figure out what sort of bits did I want to use on these guys. As these are technically assault intercessors with jump backs, I definitely wanted at least a few chainswords on there. With this guy being the Primus, I knew of the perfect piece to symbolize his status. I wanted to give him the exact same claw that is on the massive dreadnought. It even matches his posture as if the claw is incredibly heavy. The next member of this team is going to be bringing some firepower in the form of this plasma pistol. And instead of a chainsword, I'll be giving him this incredibly cool mantis looking claw. In nature, some of these claws are incredibly powerful, with the most powerful being on the mantis shrimp. I'm imagining that some of these Tyranids are able to harness it in a similar way, allowing them to be a lot more interesting than simply blunt objects. To balance the fact that this guy technically had a Space Marine helmet, I decided to avoid putting in one of the pauldrons. This was quite beneficial, because when I started working on the second shoulder pad, I noticed that I made a mistake. As much as I tried my best to avoid that, for this guy only, I managed to somehow put his wings a little bit too close, which meant that the shoulder pad would simply not go on there, so I had to cut away a very large chunk of it from the back. Fortunately, it's not really noticeable, but I'm really glad I didn't have to do the same thing for the second one. With all of their hands in mutation, I really wanted to hone in on this really specialized idea that these are shock troops. They drop from the sky and are instantly providing the maximum firepower in melee. This meant going for mutations that would have the easiest time against very powerful armor. So for all of them, I made sure to avoid going with anything that would be specializing against soft targets. Similar to my last project, I wanted to make a thematic base where my miniature is going to be standing in. Since the Bambu Lab printers are able to print really fast, I want to use it to my advantage and just go for something pretty cool and massive. So I ended up designing this hill-like surface that will actually be available for free in the description. And I'll be honest, I might have designed something way too big, but I think it's gonna look incredible once everybody's on there. Even though this is already an amazing looking stand for your miniatures, I wanted to take it one step further. So I took out the texture paste and I began spreading it across the entire surface. It was a little bit of a messy process and it took a bit of time, but I think it's gonna be well worth it. With all of the texture finally dry, I decided rather than simply just priming it in black, I'll try to create a little bit of shadow. Perhaps even separate some of the areas with the Mars red that I was planning to add later on. Things were going pretty smooth up to this point until I took out the dry pigment and I tried to spread it across the surface. Few minutes in, it became quite apparent that this was gonna be an impossible task as there was just simply no way to spread it around. So I tried something a little bit insane. I mixed in the dry pigment into my airbrush and I just began blasting it across the surface. My anticipation was that this was simply not gonna work and my airbrush was gonna get clogged. So you can imagine my surprise that when I began applying the entire thing, it was coming in a perfect layer and drying in that really cool and dry looking pigment effect. This also had an unexpected side effect. For some reason, the color was much more saturated and also a lot more red. And if you're not a fan of painting your terrain, maybe you just don't have the time for it, the A1 combo can actually paint in multicolored. So depending on what kind of spools you have on there, you can select those colors and print it in multicolors. So I found this very interesting satellite dish that came in these two colors. It was supposed to be actually blue, but I thought yellow would look a lot cooler and have that solar idea behind it. And now I just have a piece of terrain that I didn't paint that looks really awesome. As I like to watch TV shows while I paint, I also printed this laptop holder. When I actually placed my laptop into it, I sort of expected it to collapse, but it's surprisingly strong. And after playing essentially some table hockey with this thing, I got pretty confident that it's not going anywhere and it's just a very smart design. So since to print an item, all I have to do is click a button, I ended up clicking this button quite a bit and printing myself a bunch of different terrain that looks really awesome and has very different themes behind it. And Bambu Lab printers don't just print really well, they are also really pretty and they look really nice in your room. And if you want to pick up a printer for yourself, there's gonna be links in the description. There are also affiliate links, so if you do end up buying one, I'll get a little bit of a kickback as well, so thanks. Blood Angels are probably the most famous Space Marines that have wings attached to them, so I thought I'd take a little bit of inspiration from them, and instead of painting these guys in the same like space gray that I usually go for, I'll instead paint them in a very bronze looking color, almost gold, similar to the Sanguinian Guard. I definitely inadvertently got inspired by Dante because he was sitting on the shelf next to me. Getting started on this monstrous parody of the Blood Angels, I started off by airbrushing some bronze paint. To avoid a very flat looking armor, I also made sure to airbrush some additional highlights by using bright bronze. A small part of me did doubt going with this idea, especially with their Genestealer background, however, they looked simply awesome. I used a bit of black paint to cover up some of the details to get rid of the metallic shine and then also separate some of the armor panels. For the wings, I wanted to create the idea of this very dark midnight blue color. I chose a relatively simple pattern to paint the wings, but it did still prove to be a bit of a challenge when painting inside. However, painting outside the wings was incredibly pleasant and very relaxing. With each layer, I slowly worked my way up to the original blue color that I used. Each time I went with one of these lines, I did make sure to leave in just a little bit of space between them so that the previous color would be visible. I definitely enjoyed the direction they were heading, however, I thought they could use just a little bit more highlights. I added in a tiny amount of white paint to my mixture, but I used a lot of water just to make sure that the highlights would be a lot smoother. Using the airbrush, I wanted to create the idea that the edges of the wings are quite thin and are almost transparent in nature. I really enjoyed when there's a really interesting balance between the perfect transition of the airbrush and the very rough brush strokes. This also gave my wings a much needed volumetric effect. When painting the purple, I decided to avoid painting all of the wings and simply painted just the arm portion. Then I used a little bit of the rubber black to separate some of the details on the armor. With this very bright armor, I think it's going to be a very interesting contrast between the very dark details and the bright armor. As my wings were not entirely purple, I decided to use the rubber black to highlight the black areas. This was also when I had the idea to use an acrylic black wash to provide just a little bit more depth to my armor. Airbrushing a metallic creates a very perfect surface that is quite interesting, however on a Genestealer Space Marine I wanted a little bit more grit and just a little bit more depth to my armor. Since the wash was going to take a little bit of time to dry, I also took this time to base my miniatures. When I was satisfied that the wash was dry, it was time to highlight the armor. The wash provided a much needed darkness and dullness to some of the areas, but now I needed to take a very bright color and do a little bit of edge highlighting. This way, even though my armor is one color, I can separate all of the armor panels and make them look a lot better. It was time to put the Patriarch's mark on their left knee. Combination of red and gold always looks very beautiful, and in this case it also stands out and draws your attention towards it. Some of the rubber black details did look a little bit flat, especially now that I provided all of these extra highlights. So I mixed in just a little bit of ice yellow and began highlighting all of those details. When I got to painting the weapons, I was fortunate enough in that I was able to use the airbrush, but I had to be really careful as there was a lot of areas that were very close to each other. I used the paper towel to separate it and avoid some of the overspray, but I still had a few little mishaps. I finished highlighting the weapons and I got to the most important part, using some of the Bugman glow. What's interesting is up to this point I never realized that technically this head had 3 eyes. It was quite pleasant to discover another detail that was apparently hidden in plain sight the entire time. The only downside is that this meant that instead of painting 2 eyes, I had to try and paint 3 eyes, which with my incredibly shaky hands meant that I had to repaint them multiple times. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. Let's see the final result.